for years been, we haven't even copyrighted our material. We allow people to copy it, to give it away. That's what we want.
Logicked, you promised you'd help me with this Hovind seminar. Why do you keep avoiding me?
I'm practicing social distancing?
It's hell. We don't have the coronavirus.
Who said anything about a virus?
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian is trying to cover all the claims of Eric Hovind and Kent Hovind seminar so that he can earn his way back to Earth.
Sounds contrived. What's the mechanism for that again?
Wait, contrived? You're the one who told me. I don't know how this place works.
Right. Well, I'm sure it'll be fine. Let's get this over with. You first.
Here's a picture of a coral reef. The largest coral reef in the world is off the coast of Australia. It's called the Great Barrier Reef.
So far, this is scientifically accurate. Well done, Hovinds. Quit while we're ahead.
I took my whole family to Australia. My daughter and I got to go scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef. It was
absolutely
incredible.
Awesome, man. It was really, really cool.
These were obviously happier times for the Hovind clan.
Well, coral is growing. So how long has the coral reef been growing? The Great Barrier Reef, if you calculate the rate that it's growing and divide the size of that by that, you can tell how long it's been growing.
Considering that the Hovinds are so critical of uniformitarianism, the idea that nature has behaved consistently throughout time, and methods like radiometric dating that use these rates to determine how old things are, they sure are anxious to divide things by a consistent rate to determine an age. The trouble is, even fellow young Earth advocates Answers in Genesis has to acknowledge that growth rates vary substantially among coral individuals and species. There are many factors that contribute to increasing coral growth rates. Coral needs sunlight, carbon dioxide, inorganic nutrients, organic food, calcium, and carbonate in order to grow. Additionally, water movement, water temperature, water pH, and disturbance all impact coral growth rates. Those sure are a lot of variables. Seems like coral growth rate may not be a very steady clock, but I'm sure the Hovinds have taken all of this into account.
During World War II, some of the reef was destroyed by ships and anchors and bombs and stuff like that.
And stuff like that. It wasn't those pesky Germans or Japanese getting a little aggressive in parking some boats. No. The British government decided they wanted to do some nuclear testing of their own. So in 1952, they decided to drop 4 nuclear bombs at the Montebello Islands and Maralinga regions of Australia, on their own land, near their own citizens, to run some tests.
Patterns of tracer rockets crisscross the impressive and symmetrical atomic cloud formation, playing their part in the scientific record of the burst. And scientists in special protective clothing advance to the target area. Altogether, 4 atomic blasts were carried out. The development of Britain's nuclear weapons progresses apace.
It was the 4 nuclear bombs that were the problem here, Kent. Not so much boats and anchors.
So the environmentalist wackos...
Yes, because only the most tie-dye-wearing, tree-hugging, leftist radical environmentalist wackos would want their government to stop dropping nuclear weapons on their own land. Probably communists.
Went out there to see how fast it grows back.
Now, why do I get the feeling that Kent is about to use the data collected by these same environmentalist wackos he just derided? Why would he pre-mock his own source? That's almost as dumb as dropping nuclear bombs in your own territory.
They watched the reef grow for 20 years. It was a government project.
It might just be hindsight, but maybe there were some clues in his earlier work that Kent doesn't like the government.
Guess what? The Great
Based on a
Barrier Reef has been
20-year study, they
growing
said the
for
reef is less than 4,200 years old.
4,200 years.
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
All right, so Kent and Eric are both referencing this 1985 article from what used to be called Creation Ex Nihilo magazine, though you're never going to find it going to answersingenesis.org as their slides suggest. Kent's presentation is a charming throwback to a time when Answers in Genesis was still happily associated with Creation Ministries International, before the massive legal dispute in the early 2000s between Ken Ham and Carl Wayland that ended up splitting these ministries with much animosity. While it's fascinating drama, my point is that Eric's continued usage of the URL in this later presentation is what we would call a vestigial feature in the slides, in the sense that both Hovinds would deny in biology, something left over and no longer functional in the original way, but its continuing existence bears witness to a common ancestor. But we're talking about the Great Barrier Reef today, not biological evolution analogies. The Andrew Snelling article in question sources only this letter to Nature by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, a Commonwealth authority established in 1972. This was 20 years after the 1952 nuclear tests, so while it would have been studying the 20 years of regrowth, those years had already passed. They weren't staring lazily into the water for 20 years, as in Kent's dramatic reenactment. The scientific paper in question wasn't actually studying coral growth rate, but rather the correlation of river flooding and the intensity of fluorescent bands in the coral. Now don't get too excited, because I'm not going into those sexy details here. The study is important to Snelling only in that it identified a 1.8 meter, 5 foot 10 inches for my American friends, section of coral as being 118 years old. Dividing 1.8 by 118 gave this one particular piece an average growth rate of 15 millimeters a year. It's about half an inch, which will be my last update for the Americans. Just learn some metric, would ya? Now, despite many studies showing rates of reef growth in general, and Great Barrier Reef specifically, varying anywhere from 5 millimeters to 25 millimeters a year, this Ames paper recorded 15 millimeters a year in a particular spot, at a particular time, in a particular block of coral, and that was justification enough for Snelling to apply this rate to the entire, massively diverse Great Barrier Reef in general, coming up with an age of less than 3,700 years. I'm still confused why Kent and Eric expand this number to a higher 4,200 years, but I'm more confused by Snelling's completely uncited assertions about the size of the Great Barrier Reef. Snelling's article chose 55 meters as the thickness of the reef overall, seemingly based on the distance from the seafloor to the surface at some unspecified point, while the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority reports the thickness to be more than 2,000 meters in some areas of the outer reef. That means those areas would be 130,000 years old if we took Snelling's rate and methodology at face value, which we definitely should not. For one thing, over time, the topmost coral branches at maximal height are eventually crushed and broken down to denser coral sand as the newer growth weighs it down, making their lifetime thickness contribution to the reef just a fraction of its original height. Additionally, entire colonies can be and are broken loose by waves, mudslides, volcanic activity, earthquakes, or any number of natural actions, causing centuries of growth to plummet to lower levels in just a moment. Other organisms in the coral ecosystem can actually halt growth due to boring or chemical interference. If the water level dips below the coral, it will not grow. If the water level is too high, the coral will not grow. The temperature must be just right, at least 21 degrees Celsius, for the coral to grow. Each and any of these growth stoppages can be marked by a visible unconformity in the reef, and many such unconformities are found throughout the Great Barrier Reef. Lastly, coral at the water surface is observed to wear down, sometimes at the same rate as the coral growth, leaving some regions at a growth standstill for decades and centuries. The takeaway is that dividing the thickness of a coral reef by an arbitrary growth rate isn't a reliable way to determine the age of the reef. Now, I understand why the claims of reefs much older than 6,000 years would be a problem for a 6,000-year-old Earth claim. But why are the Hovinds presenting this as evidence for a young Earth?
If the Earth has been here for 4.6 billion years, why hasn't coral grown all the way around Australia a couple times?
Okay, wow. So much wrong with that. It's intended as a gotcha, but he obviously doesn't understand the scientific consensus. Coral reefs didn't start growing around Australia 4.3 billion years ago because A, coral didn't exist until the Cambrian period, around 500 million years ago, and B, the continent of Australia didn't break away from Antarctica until 30 million years ago. So 4.3 billion years of Australia coral reefs was never on the table.
Well, then I have a question. If the Earth is millions of years old, why don't we have a bigger reef someplace? Why would the biggest reef on Earth be less than 4,200 years old?
The biggest reef, the Great Barrier, is around 500,000 years old. It's true. That's pretty young compared to the oldest, the Chazy Reef, estimated to be 430 million years old. These are living things, Kent. They don't grow and grow at consistent rates forever. You wouldn't be surprised to find a 30-year-old man who is bigger than a 110-year-old man. Now, to insist that the Earth can't be 4 billion years old because the reefs are only 400 million years old is like objecting that a fridge can't be 10 years old because the milk inside is only a week old. That makes no sense, but maybe we'll hear it again later.
When it rains, 30% of the water runs into the ocean. The rest evaporates or soaks into the ground.
I don't know where you got this number from. You haven't named your source, and it's not enough detail to be able to figure out the exact source either. That being said, though, it doesn't sound unreasonable on the face of it, but I'd still kind of like to know if it's accurate. I did manage to find the USGS saying something similar, and I take them more seriously than I take you. And basically the same information they're presenting would have been accessible whenever your video was made, since the source cited by USGS for this page is Rain, a water resource, a pamphlet they published in 1988. So maybe that's the actual source you're taking this from, who knows? But if that's the case, there's a couple problems. Firstly, what the USGS is talking about are only US numbers, not global ones. So this is only going to be representative of the climate and environment of the United States. It's hard to say how much that number is going to vary when you include everywhere else on the planet, but it probably will. And secondly, unlike you, it's not saying that 70% of the water evaporates or soaks into the ground. It says 70% returns to the atmosphere through evaporation or transpiration, which makes sense to put in the same category. The remaining 30% doesn't all reach the ocean, at least not right away. It reaches the ocean or a lake or stream, either by running over land or through the ground, which you included in the 70% number. So they don't quite agree with you, and of course, one way or another, whether by evaporation and precipitation or through rivers or groundwater or whatever, not just 30%, but pretty much all water is eventually going to find its way back to the ocean, even if it takes a while. But despite your weird phrasing, I doubt that you're actually trying to imply that somehow 70% of all water from overland rainfall just stays on the land forever. I think that'd be too stupid even for you. So overall, I'd say the difference between what you say and what the USGS says is pretty minor and nothing to get too picky about, especially because these numbers obviously are approximate averages and reality is a lot more variable than that. And since I already know where you're going with this, I know that this number has pretty much zero relevance to your overall point, and so you had no real reason even to mention it, and I have no reason to care. So in talking about it, I've just wasted everyone's time, including my own. You're welcome.
Well, as it runs into the ocean, it brings with it mineral salts off the ground. It washes salts off the ground called mineral salts. The oceans are getting saltier every day because of the distillation process of sunlight evaporating water out and, minerals washing in and water coming out. The minerals don't come out, just the water.
Oh, that's what this is about? Great. I get to talk about salt. That sounds about as exciting as rocks, and everyone knows how I feel about rocks. So what you've said there is an oversimplification if I've ever heard one, to the point of being completely divorced from reality, which I know is a shock. Your phrasing implies some kind of permanency to the relocation of water from the ocean, as if that water moves inland from the ocean and just stays there forever, which of course isn't true. You said as much in the previous clip. Like, sure, water evaporates from the ocean. A lot of water evaporates from the ocean, and most of it precipitates right back in, but the amount that doesn't is going to end up precipitating over the land instead, and sooner or later, one way or another, it's going to reach the ocean again. Now, I interpreted your 30-70 thing charitably before, and I'm still going to interpret this charitably as well, even though I'm getting an uneasy feeling, and I'll assume that you don't really mean that water just leaves the ocean and 70% of it never returns. Of course, most of it winds up back where it started. There's a constant flow of fresh water into the ocean, and while that water will bring along some amount of salt and other minerals with it, there's not that much of that stuff in there. Not relative to the volume of the ocean and the amount of salt already in it. It's a very slow drip of salt into the ocean. So right from the start, there's more stability to this process than you let on with the way you presented this. But even so, over very long geologic periods of time, if we assume a constant slow addition of salt with no removal from the ocean, then yeah, the very gradual increase would add up to something really significant. And so I guess that's the real question here. What you said is that the minerals don't come out. The water comes out of the ocean, but the minerals, nope, never. Now, whether you mean minerals in general or just salt, I guess who knows, but I can guess. I think from the context, we can safely assume that what you're talking about is sodium, being a component of the type of salt that you're used to, table salt, and having a much longer residence time than other components of ocean salt like magnesium, potassium, calcium, meaning it stays in the ocean a lot longer, something like 60 odd million years, as opposed to say magnesium with like 10 million, calcium with 1 million. So just to be clear for the rest of this video, when I say salt, I'm using that as a shorthand for what I assume Kent means, which is sodium, and chloride, which also has a really long residence time. I'm also cheating on that guess just a tiny little bit, because there's this creationist paper about sea salt written in 1990, which I'm pretty sure is where Kent got this idea from, and we're going to have a glance at it a little bit later in the video. And all it's talking about is sodium, dissolved sodium in the ocean, but it's referring to it as salt. So I'm reasonably confident that's what we're talking about. So the whole premise here is interesting. You talk as if the only process that ever removes anything from the ocean is evaporation that removes fresh water, and all the salt content just stays there permanently, which sounds intuitive, I guess, but it's just too bad that intuitive doesn't mean true. There are plenty of processes that remove salt from ocean water to varying degrees. Let's start where you started, with the fact that water flowing to the ocean brings some amount of salt with it. Now, it's true that some of that is going to dissolve and go to increasing the salinity of the water, but it's also true that some of it won't, and it's just going to sink to the sediment on the bottom. Some other amount of it is going to be incorporated into sea life, and either remain there as the food chain does its thing, or eventually find its way to the sediment by way of waste products. Whichever way the salt happens to find its way to the sediment, in time that sediment is going to harden into sedimentary rock, which can stay there on the bottom of the ocean for a long time, of course, but may eventually be lifted out. A lot of people watching are probably familiar with the fact that seashells are found on land way above sea level, because that land was gradually pushed up from under the ocean. Well, that exact same process can carry sedimentary salt out of the ocean. There are also more direct mechanisms transferring salt to the land. As you might expect, a decent number of these occur along the coasts. There are various ways that the coasts can retain salt. For example, you can have evaporation of seawater on beaches or from enclosed pools or lagoons. Spoiler, I'm going to bring up a great large-scale example of that later in the video. You also have salt particles being carried inland by sea spray, which is caused by waves and other processes, which might not sound like it would be that significant if you're not used to living near the ocean, but those who have lived near the ocean will know that this effect is pretty significant. Metal corrodes faster, which has to be taken into account during construction in coastal areas, even a pretty good distance away from the coast. Clouds form easier because of the extra particles in the air. Plant variety is affected to favor plants that can tolerate the saltiness, and obviously when salt is spread scattershot around the land like that, a lot of it's going to end up staying there, not making its way back to the ocean. As you might imagine, the efficiency of these coastal processes at removing salt from the ocean only increase as the ocean gets saltier, because the water that's evaporating away or spraying away from the ocean carrying the salt with it is saltier in the first place. And this helps to retain some degree of balance, because as more salt is added, more salt is removed. So with these different kinds of balancing effects, the impermanence of freshwater removal, the mechanisms of salt removal, any global average change to salinity, if it's present at all, is very slow. And at times in the past, it easily could have been balanced or even reversed. And that's precisely because the balance is fragile and it can be tipped in either direction. It's not some constant thing, it's a result of what's happening at any given time. It's a messy real-world process. It varies based on things like the amount of salt that's being carried in rivers, which is a result of where the rivers are running and what's in the ground they're running through, and the acidity of their water, all of which can change. The amount of fresh water stored away in lakes, which can change. The amount of fresh water being added or removed from the system, which changes with things like glacial formation and melting, and the closing and opening of access to more enclosed bodies of water. The amount of salt being removed, which varies based on the length, type, and conditions of the coast, and the salinity of the water, and the behavior of sea life, and who knows what else. I'm sure there's a million factors I'm not even aware of. I make no claim to being an expert on this, but what I know for sure is that this is much more complex than you're making it out to be. It's not as simple as minerals go in and don't come out. And furthermore, there's absolutely no reason to assume that whatever the current rate of salinity change might be, that's been constant or even nearly the same throughout all time. It makes sense to think of some processes that way, but not processes like this one. Honestly, for a guy who outright rejects the idea that things in the past must have operated the same way they do in the present, you sure are taking that idea that they do to an irrational extreme, way beyond what any so-called evolutionist would.
The way things are happening now is the way they've always been happening. That's the idea behind uniformitarianism, which I think is absolutely ludicrous and silly, but that's the idea. So if we see a river getting a little bit, cutting a canyon a little bit deeper every year, eroding the bottom, we then do the math and calculate how long it took. That's the idea behind uniformitarianism, which is silly.
The sheer number of variables involved here, especially so many that can easily change over time and have a real effect on the input and output balance of sea salt, I would say is the biggest reason why trying to date the Earth with something like ocean salinity is a fool's errand. To date something, you have to find a process where you know the starting conditions, meaning in this case the salinity of the ocean at the start, and can have relative confidence in its stability over time. So that'd be things like radioactivity or tree ring growth. And even with those methods, cross-confirming against other methods is highly advisable if you want to ensure accuracy. And you definitely don't have that, considering those other methods all imply the Earth is more than 6,000 years old. Now, I guess you could always trot out some article that disagrees with this assessment, though. If I may, I would suggest this Scientific American article about dating the ocean by its salt content from 1913.
Today, the oceans are 3.6% salt. They could have done that in less than 5,000 years.
Who's they? Poseidon and Triton?
Oceans today are 3.6% salt. They could easily go from freshwater to 3.6% salt in less than 5,000 years.
Oh, thank you, Eric. That's much more clear. All right, then I agree. They could. I guess a bunch of big ol' salty meteors could have crashed into the ocean or something. Yeah, of course that could have happened. That doesn't mean it did. Doesn't mean there's any evidence it did. Doesn't mean it lines up with any other lines of evidence we have. Doesn't mean we should believe it happened. And I find it an odd thing for you to be considering, given that just a few seconds ago you seemed so into pretending that current rates of average salinity change must have been constant forever, which at the very least would put the age of the Earth into the millions, not the thousands of years, if you started with fresh water. But if you've deconverted from your hardline uniformitarianism, I guess we can roll with it. So for this to be a meaningful statement, meaning for it to actually be worth believing based on it that the ocean went from 0% to 3.6% salt in 5,000 years, you'd need to provide some kind of means of determining the rate of salinity change over time, including the change in that rate over time, to provide some kind of a time dimension to what you're saying, right? You're trying to establish how long it took. Well, we need some kind of way to actually do that. Because right now, all you're actually saying is a thing happened, and I think it could have happened quick. Well, that's fantastic. I think it could have happened slow. Who cares? But honestly, I'm not sure why you'd bother anyway doing any of this, because really, what's it going to benefit you? Even if you succeed, I mean, after all, even if you could establish that the rate of change of salinity was wildly higher within just the past few thousand years for some reason, to such a degree that a freshwater ocean turned salty less than 5,000 years ago, that wouldn't do what you think it does, which is prove the maximum age of the Earth. Proving the ocean turned salty in 5,000 years wouldn't prove the Earth is 5,000 years old any more than proving that I got fat in 2 months would prove I'm 2 months old. Plenty of things happen in the course of 5,000 years on Earth. Adding another one to the list doesn't make the Earth 5,000 years old.
I was in a debate one time and this atheist said, Hovind, would you please tell me how the freshwater fish survived Noah's flood? I said, well, sir, aren't you assuming the flood was salt water? He said, the ocean is salt water. I said, well, yeah, it is today. I think during the flood it's probably mostly fresh water. He said, well, how did the saltwater fish survive? I said, well, there probably weren't any. He said, the ocean is full of saltwater creatures. I said, well, yeah, it is today. I said, I think what happened over the last 400 years, some animals have gradually become adapted to saltwater. And today we have freshwater alligators and freshwater crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles. And they probably had a common ancestor, a crocodile. He said, that's evolution. I said, oh, it is not. Going from a freshwater croc to a saltwater croc is a minor change compared to what you believe.
I'm not going to bother talking about freshwater fish or saltwater fish or crocodiles or whatever. It's kind of beside the point. Instead, I want to talk about something that I find kind of amusing, which is that the Institute of Creation Research has an article that basically rebuts your exact idea that the flood was freshwater and the ocean turned salty over the next few thousand years. I mean, really what they're trying to do here is debunk the old Earth, but they do catch you in the crossfire, Ken. They say, by being as generous as we can for the evolutionist regarding sodium input and output rates, the ocean's age is only 40 to 60 million years. Well, they're entitled to their calculation, I suppose. It doesn't match anyone else's. Except that guy I mentioned whose paper was from 1913, and people from before that. Mainly because trying to date the Earth by ocean salinity has long since been recognized as garbage, because it makes no sense. Like, even in principle, it doesn't make any sense. It's far too variable. This obviously is far short of the uniformitarian, evolutionary age of 3 billion years. But the 40 to 60 million years old age is considerably more than the thousands of years creation scientists maintain is the biblical/scientific age of this planet. The discrepancy lies in the assumption that there was no sodium in the oceans at creation, and that all salt has been added at present rates since that time. Yeah, that's kind of a dumbass assumption, isn't it? Both of them. However, the modern creation science model of Earth's history begins with a saltwater environment in which the newly created saltwater fish would swim. Exactly how salty the oceans were cannot be known. So basically what they're saying is that Kent's claim that the post-flood oceans were freshwater, combined with his weird out-of-character assumption that current rates of salinity change must have always been the same, would make the world 40 to 60 million years old. And so his position, if true, would debunk the young Earth. Now, of course, I don't think it debunks shit, because this is all based on the faulty premise that ocean salt content works well for dating the Earth, but Kent agrees that that is the case. The fact that he thinks salt works well as a dating mechanism is the whole point of this clip, so it's pretty funny.
So you believe they changed from a rock to a croc. Now there's a major change for you folks. Yes, sir.
I'm not going to dignify that with an answer. I have a whole series on Hovind Sr. I've obviously talked about this before, and I'm not going to do it again.
How come the salt content in the oceans fits consistently with the creation worldview and not with the evolutionary worldview?
It's got nothing to do with evolution, Eric, but it fits with an old Earth just fine.
Because if evolution is true and the world's been here for millions of years, the ocean should be kind of like the Dead Sea right now.
Funny you should mention the Dead Sea, because the Dead Sea is actually a really good demonstration of why the ocean doesn't just keep getting saltier forever. In fact, it's a great example of those coastal processes I was talking about that remove salt from the ocean at large. See, the Dead Sea is really salty, something like 10 times saltier than average ocean water. The thought is that the entire region from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea was a lagoon, called the Saddam Lagoon. I don't know how to pronounce that, and that let water in and out from the Mediterranean, which resulted in the gradual deposition of salt that's responsible for the Dead Sea being so salty. And over time, due to tectonic activity, the region became landlocked and no longer exchanged water with the Mediterranean, which made it no longer in any sense part of the ocean. But all that salt that was gradually deposited over all those times that the ocean water came and went stayed. So in other words, just this one lagoon removed a large amount of salt from the ocean, specifically the Mediterranean. And interestingly enough, the Mediterranean Sea, which kindly donated its salt to the Dead Sea, is itself similar to the Dead Sea. It's an enclosed, unusually salty body of water with a thick layer of salt sediment on the bottom. And over time, the Mediterranean, just like the Dead Sea, is probably going to be cut off from the larger body of water, in this case the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, the interface between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic is the Strait of Gibraltar, and if that closes, the Mediterranean most likely will evaporate and leave its salt on land, and through evaporation gradually donate its fresh water back to the ocean. And all of this seems to have happened before, about 5.5 million years ago, which reduced average ocean salinity globally by something like 5% until the strait finally opened up again and the water came back to the Mediterranean. And that's exactly what I mean about these processes having the ability to remove significant amounts of salt from the ocean. But back to the Dead Sea though, so it's so salty that it's close to the saturation point of water, and sometimes it's above the saturation point. There are basically snowfalls of salt to the bottom that build up a thick layer of salt sediment. And it's thought that this could be because of differences in the saturation point between the warmer upper water and the cooler lower water, because since warmer water can be more saline than cooler water, when disturbances happen between the warmer layer and the cooler layer, moving some of that warmer water down into the cooler water, because it was already so close to saturation, when it cools down it can't hold the salt, and so the salt separates from that water and drifts down to the sediment layer on the bottom. And this happens so much that that layer increases by multiple centimeters a year. So despite Kent saying that the minerals never leave the water, this is a visual demonstration that they do in fact leave the water. The Dead Sea naturally extracts tons and tons of salt from water all the time.
You shouldn't even be able to get in those things, man. That's how bad they should be, the amount of mineral content in the oceans.
And that's just a nothing statement. I was hoping to end my segment with some kind of a bang, but I guess not. Your turn, Paul.
Here's a picture of Niagara Falls. The textbook says, boys and girls, the rocky ledge above Niagara Falls has been eroding for 9,900 years.
I'm not sure what kind of textbook Kent pulled this from, but consensus since at least the 70s has been that modern Niagara began more than 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. But both numbers are much higher than the 6,000-year Hovind estimate for the age of the Earth. So let's not dwell on that. Let's just see where they're going with this.
Well, it's pretty interesting. The rocks are breaking off the edge. All waterfalls do that. You know, rocks break off the edge, and the waterfall eats its way backwards. The water flows one way, the waterfall moves the other way in response to the erosion. They've studied Niagara Falls pretty carefully for the last 200 years. They say it's moving back 4.7 feet a year. Interesting. All right, this textbook says a simple calculation shows it's been 9,900 years worth of erosion.
So you're just throwing up another slide reaffirming the 9,900 years? Are you not going to try to explain how Niagara Falls started forming 3,000 years before the creation of the Earth?
Well, you throw one flood in there, and that makes up about half of it.
Wait, no article from a creationist organization? No feigning a convoluted explanation? Just throw one flood in there and that makes up half of it? Is there any kind of rationale here, Eric? Or did you just say half because half of 9,900 is 4,450, the number you're looking for?
So yeah, I would say Niagara Falls is probably about 4,400 years old.
Wow, okay. Eric would say, based on, as far as we can tell, literally nothing. A good feeling. Why did he include this in his seminar? Just, I think it's young, so let's move on.
I got a question now. If the Earth is millions of years old, why hasn't it eroded all the way back to Lake Erie?
Alright, so at least Papa Hovind is going to use this as another attempt at telling us that the fridge can't be old because the milk is young. Even Answers in Genesis acknowledges that the Niagara area was covered in ice until the end of the last ice age, which by their model was immediately after the flood. But timeline aside, leading creationists agree with scientific consensus that the features of Niagara Falls didn't start developing until after the last ice age. This erosion does not go back to the start of the world. No one thinks so, except, for some reason, Kent Hovind, who didn't even bother to propose why the 9,900 years he gives would be explained in his flood model. This is just silly.
Well, that was fun. Great work, as always. But listen, you might want to just think about giving up and staying down here. Your Earth has pretty much descended into unrecognizable chaos this month.
I know about the virus. I'm fine with a few weeks of quarantine.
Quarantine? What are you talking about? I'd sign up for that myself. No, I mean, when's the last time you checked your channel? It's the end times, my friend. End times.
A little melodramatic, don't you think? Fine, let's just see. We're seeing so many things that no one could have predicted.
Yeah, like Eric Hovind on Paulogia's channel? What?
What?
Poor bastard. Alright, thanks for watching, everyone. Go check out Paul's channel. He's a good guy. I'm sure you'll like his stuff. Subscribe to him, subscribe to me, give the video a like. All that stuff is extremely helpful. And I guess that's all I got to say. So, I will see you in a week. Yep.